Hello, everybody, and welcome to another monthly reading wrap-up, where today we will be getting to 4 books. Cyberpunk No Coincidence, Mad Uncle McGillicuddy's, The Frugal Wizard's Handbook for Surviving Medieval England, I finally got that title right first try, and Mob Psycho 100. I do apologize for having a little bit lighter of a reading load this month. It's mainly just due to the fact that moving out of state takes a heck of a lot of time out of your schedule. That being said, though, we're going to go ahead and start off with Cyberpunk No Coincidence, which an amazing number of you really pushed higher and higher on my TBR. I didn't expect there to be this much hype for a Cyberpunk book, but at least in my audience, quite a few people really wanted to know my thoughts on it. I hope they were expecting a mixed bag response, because that's what I have. I don't think this is bad, but I don't think it's perfect either. I have a lot of criticisms and some praise. Getting into just the setup of the story, though, Cyberpunk No Coincidence follows a group of strangers who have to pull off a series of jobs together they are actually blackmailed into committing to. They have no idea who this employer of theirs is, and just how deadly the game of cat and mouse they've been roped into is. This book was written by Rafael Kosick, and yes, just getting rid of any confusion. This absolutely takes place in Night City from the game Cyberpunk 2077 or the board game RPG Cyberpunk Red. I did go into this book with very low expectations just because I've had a history of books based off of games not being the best reads, but this certainly was better than I expected. And I want to start with one of the big pieces of praise. Desperation is a fantastic tool to work with as an author in terms of motivating characters, elevating tense scenes, but also if it successfully permeates the pages, having this inevitable feeling towards conclusions being reached that are regretted. If you're having desperation kind of push forward almost every single move you make, messiness, sloppiness, in a good way, are inevitable. And that is probably one of the strongest elements to Cyberpunk No Coincidence. It feels that each major story that takes place in this world wants to examine some consequence or idea in the total just defeatist philosophy that is supposed to be within the cyberpunk genre. It's not exactly a happy-go-lucky outcomes genre. It usually falls into the territory for end conclusions for characters. But just like when it comes to 2077's ideas around futility, No Coincidence really thrives when it is inflicting that feeling of desperation onto the reader through the characters. And that's because it just feels really human, especially in these situations this cast of characters is in, to have those moments where the animal part of your brain manages to grab onto the wheel and start veering you off the intelligent course. We've all felt that, whether it's almost getting into a car crash or just a bump in the night that makes us suddenly start believing in ghosts. Transitioning though to another compliment, I will also say Coincidence does a really good job of setting a tempo with an opening action sequence, where if you're hooked by that much action and the type of characterization on display there, you will probably be interested in the entire book. If that turns you off though, you kind of know this isn't for you. It's just a very good tempo setter. Though, that leads a nice transition to my biggest criticism for the book as a whole, and something that I would just say flat out falls into the bad territory for me, and that is just the structure of No Coincidence is rough. This does not feel like the story was originally written to be a book. Something about reading this continually hits like it was originally an idea for a show, where they didn't bother restructuring the scenes or much to fit a book, and instead just rewrote the existing story from a script into a novel. And due to that, pretty much at no point while reading this book was I able to successfully sink deeply into a scene and feel that total immersion that I really look for as a reader. It was just jumping around far too often and had so many breaks that felt entirely unnecessary. Structure is No Coincidence's biggest flaw, and it's almost in the crippling territory for me. I would have liked the version of this book that was maybe single POV, possibly even first person, going through the same story with just a better utilization of conveying information to the reader than what we got. And in this rapid jumping around, we get characterization that feels about as deft as a drunk nurse using a sewing needle, which, to be fair, is kind of on brand for this whole franchise. I don't think anyone thinks the characterization in Edge Runners or 2077 was subtle. This is just the least subtle we've seen so far. Whereas in the other stories, it just felt like the bombastic cyberpunk genre. This felt a bit more just overall ham-fisted to me. All that being said, though, I still do have a couple more big positives to say. In terms of atmosphere and world building, if you are a fan of the feeling of being in Night City, I'm gonna sound like an IGN game reviewer, but this book does really make you feel at times like you are in Night City. Granted, some of those instances feel more like fan service than not, and despite there being a bit too much action for me, I actually enjoyed how diverse the action does come across at times, because the author Rafael Kosick seems to have taken the time to really look into all the different tools that can come into play when hits the fan in Night City. And so while there is just an over-the-top number of action sequences, they don't ever feel entirely one note because there is such a large arsenal of things to pull from creatively. Just totally boiling it down, No Coincidence thrives in its world building, its atmosphere, and the cat and mouse elements in the narrative that were solid enough, though I would have liked a little more paranoia in there. If you like fun heists, this franchise as a whole, loads of gore and hypersexuality, Cyberpunk No Coincidence certainly should be on your radar, though I wouldn't push it to the top of your TBR. And if none of those things feel exactly up your alley, this falls into the just skip it, absolutely. I'd give Cyberpunk No Coincidence a soft 6 out of 10. I did have fun with this book, it's just not going to stick in my brain beyond a month or two. And on page 27, having it said he didn't believe in coincidences in a book called No Coincidence should let you know exactly what you're getting into. I don't believe in coincidences. That's a line. That's a line said no coincidence.
Summer is drawing to a close. Gone are the days of sweat-soaked teas, sandal tans, and sunblock stains. It's time to embrace your autumnal evolution. Bask in the glory of cinnamon-scented pine cones, frolic in flannel amongst the apple orchards, build yourself a shrine of butternut squash candles as you pump pumpkin spice latte directly into your veins. Or, change up your routine with Scentbird. For only $17 a month, you'll get to pick a scent that interests you most. So there are no surprises. It's really easy to use too. Just slip the new fragrance into your refillable atomizer case and you're good to go. Daniel's personal favorite this month was Good Habits Pause, which contained notes of cedarwood and musk along with jasmine and vanilla blossom. They work directly with designer brands such as Prada and Versace, but they also have a ton of niche brands for you to explore, like House of Beau and Confessions of a Rebel. So head on over to Scentbird.com to try out a 30-day supply for only $17. And when you find the perfect fit, you can choose to upgrade to the full size. And be sure to use the code FANTASYNEWS at checkout to save 55% off your first month. Available in the USA and Canada. Scentbird.com.
Next up, we're totally recording in the same day and session and everything, is a Frugal Wizard's Handbook for Surviving. Next up, we have a Frugal Wizard's Handbook for Surviving Medieval England. And I hate to say that this might be my least favorite of the secret projects, and possibly my least favorite Sanderson book. It's not horrible, but I had a hard time with this one in a way that's quite the opposite of my criticisms of No Coincidence. I found the structure and pacing of this book for the first 3/4 to be really solid, and it was whimsical. Bland. I've seen a little bit of conversation about whether or not this is like Sanderson's Hitchhikers or something along those lines. I don't love those kind of comparisons in review, and I want to just look at this for what it is. And the Frugal Wizard's Handbook for Surviving Middle England is the story of a character named Johnny, who wakes up in a fantastical interpretation of medieval England that is quite different than our own, and has to figure out the mystery around the circumstances of his fish out of water situation. Scattered about him are the pages to the Frugal Wizard's Handbook, etc., and from there's a really good premise here. I get how writing this book, it could feel like a wonderful idea to tell, maybe slightly oriented towards a younger audience than your typical Sanderson book story. And I do want to say before I get into the rest of this, if you have a young reader in your house who maybe isn't quite old enough to get into the Stormlight Archive and comprehend all of that, the Frugal Wizard's Handbook is a wonderful way to introduce a young reader to Sanderson's writing without the commitment or the baggage of the wider Cosmere. I could absolutely see this book being a fun nostalgia read for a reader way down the road who reads at a young age now. I hope no one takes me saying that as me insulting an adult who did like this book. Of course not. There are tons of books aimed at children that I adore, so I just want to make that distinction. Just because I note a book is aimed at a smaller audience does not mean it's a bad book or you're like wrong for enjoying it. And despite going into this book with a bit lower expectations just to the word of mouth around it for the secret projects, I still felt like I was a sucker to end up liking this book. I love alternate parallel universe stories that are similar to our own yet different, and I actually found the narrative device of having the pages of the Wizard's Handbook throughout this book to be maybe my favorite angle of the story as a whole. I actually liked the narrative Easter eggs and hints you get through just seeing these pages in the book more than the exposition dumps we got in Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. It's actually probably the one angle of this book I did like more than that book. There's just a creative presentation here that seems like it's just fully committed to and paid off quite well. The problems, though, come in here, especially for me with execution of premise, characterization, and theme. John West, just doesn't have that much personality to me, and while there were certainly moments I felt like a lot of promise to be delivered on later, he never really lived up to be interesting enough to carry a story like this. I find fish out of water stories, you need to have a protagonist who has a strong character, like through and through you understand them, and that way the juxtaposition of who they are and where they're from, as opposed to where they are now and how they have to behave, becomes a source of comedy and a source of conflict. It just always felt like it was half as much as was actually needed for this premise to succeed. Now, don't be mistaken in thinking that Johnny is from our Earth. No, he is not. Where he is from has like a Seattle and a police force, but there are details I'll leave vague now that let us know he is for sure not from like Earth, whatever you want to call our Earth. Earth Zero. But in this world, Johnny has augments that allow him to present himself as above and beyond, and hence the escape kind of situation we're in, where people are using, yes, the Frugal Wizard's Handbook to explore these other dimensions. And with it being a Sanderson story, you know the world building within this dimension is solid enough in terms of ideas. I was just surprised by how lackingly cohesive so many of the ideas kind of came together when it came to the actual story. In fact, the whole narrative here, instead of feeling like a grand adventure this one guy is on, for a lot of the book just seemed like a series of events happening to a guy, and then at the end, when all of it tried to be pulled together, there wasn't that oomph, that sense of momentum where it all blended into that huzzah of a Sanderlanche so many of his fans expect, and with some twists that were put in as well that just did not land, I would say, are just definitively my least favorite Sanderson story reveal twists ever. Compared to the emotional high of the end of Yumi and the Nightmare Painter, this just kind of hit nothing but flat notes for me. Historically for me, usually Sanderson as an author is pretty great when it comes to sleight of hand in terms of storytelling. He's really good at introducing a beat here and then paying it off in a way over here that you don't necessarily expect. It's a fundamental part of being any kind of engaging storyteller, especially in fiction. But I'm sad to say, as the story progressed and more was put into the story, from the small details to, yes, the character choices, all of it broke my immersion, not due to a structure reason like we saw with No Coincidence, but just because so much of this book felt like plodding along interesting ideas from Sanderson, but not having any poignancy to what was being done. His sleight of hand as an author, which is usually solid, was way off. Like, something just felt like this was not written by the same author who can do the reveals of like Stormlight. I will say, as a strong positive note to end on here, there is one theme with the character of Johnny that I actually found myself resonating with, that revolved around the idea of how other people speak to you, how abuse is inflicted upon you can change how you perceive oneself, and overcoming that is a really big part of self-growth and overcoming flaws that might plague your entire life if you do not address them. That was the one element at the end of the book I did find myself thinking, yes, this is paying off to satisfaction. And the final thing before we get into spoilers, pay attention to the doodles on this specific book if you would like essentially a free second story. That's all I will say. Pay attention to the doodles here. It was so much fun, and totally pulling aside from the actual story here, the presentation of this book, I think some people, even if they don't end up loving the story, will say makes the money worth the cost, because this might be the most decorated of the secret projects yet. So if that is your inclination as a reader to really enjoy those type of additional frivolities, A Frugal Wizard's Handbook could still absolutely be a pickup for you. Though for me, it's sitting between a 5 to a 6. If you would like to avoid spoilers for A Frugal Wizard's Handbook, skip to this time code, but 3, 2, 1, we're getting into them now. The end reveal with his dead love interest, where she's alive and was cheating on him and was just in here the whole time, felt insanely out of left field, and the emotional response from the characters to that, no. Everyone didn't have a big enough reaction to that, including Johnny, and the way they even convey it to him just felt wrong. Like, that's not how a human being would even think it would be okay to tell someone the big reveal of what they're talking about, especially with all the events that are happening around it. And then the big reveal of the goddess and the powers and the sickly sweet happy ending we get is part of the reason why I think, especially age range from like 10 to 13, this could still be a big old positive, because I think this is oriented more towards those readers. I have to review it from my perspective. I'm sorry if it seems like I'm coming across harsh. But it was sickly sweet. It felt like I was eating pure buttercream frosting with no cake. And once we reunite with Ryan and the story's pacing grinds to a halt as we just have too much of characters not progressing forward with the narrative, that is where the whimsy became outweighed by other flaws. And it's safe to say this is probably, the more I talk about it especially, my least favorite Sanderson book. I'm just happy I don't have to say it's a Cosmere book. I also am not the biggest Skyward fan. That series and this are going to be competing. But hey, if your worst in your entire career is still sitting like 5 to 6 for me, that's pretty damn good. Let me know your thoughts on The Frugal Wizard's Handbook for Surviving Medieval England, the most difficult title to say of any book I've read this year. And now we move on to Mad Uncle McGillicuddy's. And now we are in Boston to talk about Mad Uncle McGillicuddy, Secret Imagination Explorer, before we finish this off with Mob Psycho, the first 50 chapters. I'm very happy to say that Mad Uncle McGillicuddy's was written by a member of the Goblin Horde, and I'm always so excited to talk about one of you all's books. And this might be the book I have read this year that is clearly aimed at the youngest audience yet. As you can probably tell with a title like Mad Uncle McGillicuddy's Secret Imagination Explorer, this is a rather wholesome read. Though, you could also take that title in the super horror territory, I guess. But I was expecting something along the lines tonally of Willy Wonka. That's not what I got. Instead, Mad Uncle McGillicuddy's is the rather simple story of a family on hard times due to a loss of a father and other financial troubles, being helped by a man named, you guessed it, Mad Uncle McGillicuddy. And this man has apparently left this downtrodden family his house, and from there we get to figure out what exactly the secret imagination exploring aspect of this story is going to be through some world hopping. The best parts of this book are the family itself, and specifically the different personalities between the children. They are very believably within the age group they are in, with a sprinkling of that capable protagonist over top, and especially the improvements they do go through are justified within the text. My problem with this story does come in though with just how little we are given aside from just justifications of development of character. It feels like narrative for Mad Uncle McGillicuddy's is streamlined to the point of borderline being crippling, and it's why I would specifically recommend this book to kids who are maybe not quite old enough to get into like a series of unfortunate events, because it asks very, very little of the reader and hands you just about everything you need to take away from this text overtly. About as bluntly as I've ever come across, in fact. Combine that with the just ridiculously sweet and over-the-top tone that permeates throughout, undercut quite nicely by an aura of mystery, and the end result is, yes, this is something I would say specifically is for an age group that's like one chunk down from the series of unfortunate events audience. In age, I mean. Most of the world building that happens here happens happens in worlds that are incredibly one-dimensional and serve a purpose to get that child to make a realization and grow in a way to then come back and be reflected in the wider plot. I really wish there was some more metatextual things going on or other things I could take away as a reader, even if I did read this as a young kid, come back to it as an adult and then read it again and go, oh wow, I didn't pick up on that. There's pretty much none of that here, and while it is certainly fine to write novellas, you can still build a fleshed out world within a novella format, and this just didn't really use the time efficiently well enough, and with the name like Imagination Explorer, I was really hoping for that. Still though, it's a fun time and tonally consistent. The characterization is super strong for a debut novella. This is maybe the shortest book I've read this year, shortest novella even, and I think while it doesn't need to be in that full novel length, it certainly could have benefited from bulking out those pages quite a bit. For example, the main villain is kind of just, we're told about them, they have their influence on the story and the emotional connection, but in terms of personality, greater motivation, reason whys, or any more history beyond that, it's all pretty much as surface level and just checklist as it could be. Overall, I'm going to be giving Mad Uncle McGillicuddy's Secret Imagination Explorer a very solid 5.5 out of 10. I respect it a lot for what it's trying to do and think it's hitting a market it's attempting to hit super efficiently. It's just absolutely not for me, and I've seen what it's attempting to do done better. Though, for a debut self-published, I found surprisingly few editing mistakes, while there are still some there, and if you have a young reader, you want to get into fantasy, this is a great way to start. That takes us, though, to a tonal shift into Mob Psycho, which may be officially the funniest manga I have read yet. And I've read One Piece up to Wano. I got through the first 50 chapters, which I feel like is a good stopping point to hit, certainly more than what I've been doing with series like Monster, where I've only gotten through volume by volume before reviewing. It feels better to be doing a bigger chunk of the story like this, because I have a lot more to talk about. And I'm liking Mob Psycho well enough to, once I finish all 100, I believe, chapters, I'm going to be doing a spoiler-filled deep dive, most likely, into it review-wise. But for now, I just want to talk about, spoiler-ish free, what I like so much about Mob Psycho. Conceptually, Mob Psycho has so much fun kind of poking fun at the supernatural community while fully embracing it. It doesn't feel like it's making fun, just having fun with. What Mob Psycho is to like supernatural horror, it feels like what Hot Fuzz is to an action movie. It is clearly having fun with what is inspiring it, but it's so knowledgeable of it that it's reverent. It's not at all diminishing and instead almost just enhancing with its comedic value. There are jokes like the main character clearly being set down a path to join up with like a club of kids who are interested in the supernatural, but then just screwing them over and joining up with the jocks because that's funnier. And adds a motive to a 14-year-old character that makes complete sense and demonstrates how he views his own powers in the most blasé way possible. Mob, who I'll be referring to the main protagonist as, also like takes down a cult leader and has the cult leader come back as this tiny little adorable ghost very early on in the series. That's not a major spoiler, don't worry. But his interactions with Dimple are funny enough, but there's even jokes following that up. Like the cult followers, after seeing their cult leader taken down, don't like learn a lesson and try and grow from their culty ways, and instead are just immediately reverent to Mob, which makes sense because he displays superpowers and it's just kind of casually, continually dropped on people, at least throughout the first 50 chapters. And I'm saying all of that well aware that there are jokes made throughout this 50 chapters that just in the way they're presented, I'm assuming I'm just not getting because there's specific references to manga series that I haven't gotten through. I did spot one just straight up mentioning of One Punch Man. Pulling back away from that though, let's talk about the wider themes of Mob Psycho and what makes this humor really work. So much of early Mob Psycho revolves around conning or exploitation, not only of our character, but the wider community as a whole, people who are willing to believe and put their faith in someone that is just full of shit. And this plays into the setting of a kid in middle school. I believe his age is just 14, hilariously, because he's naive and he's easy to exploit, but he has this power within him that everyone simultaneously drastically underestimates. There's something about the whole presentation of Mob Psycho that feels like an 80s punk movie focusing on middle schoolers. Maybe that is the right way to put it. The kids act super like kids. And the conflict then spawns off from that, where yes, they do end up going against some bigger, badder teams of villains, but the stakes always feel somewhat grounded back to that schoolyard mentality. And I feel like it would be a significant mistake to talk about this series and not mention the character work, because Mob is one of those characters who is the highly reserved, but we get an incredibly close view into his thought process, as manga so often does. And it allows you to see a surprising amount of depth, and specifically
conviction,
within such a young character that you don't always get. And accidentally that could spiral into Mob feeling far too old for his age, but I don't think it enters that territory. If I had to give a big criticism of Mob Psycho, this might just be because I read 50 chapters in one day. The art style, it's intentionally mediocre most of the time. I mean, you don't draw this and put it in your manga expecting it to be revered like Berserk or One Piece, and I've certainly been spoiled with the level of artwork I have gotten in the manga series I've consumed. I'm well aware of that. But chapter after chapter after chapter of these faces, it does get a bit tiring, though there are sparks of brilliance in terms of composition or choices made artistically, like this one, for example, that are still raising this above where I imagine like the standard would be. And I feel like there are actual real pops of absurdity in the art style, like this body being on an 8th grader, what? That just enhance and draw you in deeper to this experience. So the art is certainly accomplishing what it intends to. It's trying to be this almost rebellious, even in the art form approach. It's just also not the best to look at. I mean, look at this guy. He's 14, I assume, and it looks like he's been smoking 6 packs a day since he was in the fetus. Pulling away from the art style, though, and instead getting into the implementation of the style and like the creatures and the magics and the action, I actually found it all communicated really clearly. There's surprising thought put into a lot of the emotional narrative beats here. I mean, this alone, this character twist that I'm putting completely out of context, so hopefully if you haven't read it, you don't get it, is genuinely amazing. And while the cast of side characters is shuffling in and out so much that it becomes a bit confusing, a bit overwhelming, the staple characters succeed at exactly what they're trying to do. Dimple, second favorite character at this point, I'd say. And the end note I want to talk about here, where I think Mob Psycho finds a lot of its magic, pun intended, is that it treats children's emotions as valid while not thinking of them as complex as adults, but then allowing the emotions, the actions from these kids to result in some pretty complex morally situations. I mean, Mob does not want to use his powers against regular people, and that is a substantial conflict early on, where even if someone is threatening people, he just says, no, it's wrong, I won't do that. Which, for him, stupid, too straightforward. There's got to be exceptions. But the fact that he won't bend and he's rigid results in a lot of conflict. Which results in him just basically pointing out the psychological flaws of the person who's trying to get him to be violent and like viciously, verbally taking him down. It's pretty great. And then Mob hits 100%, and that's a whole other bag of beans. In a month of fairly average reads for me, I'm happy to say that Mob Psycho just runs away with most enjoyable read this month and is at a solid 8.5 out of 10. It's dripping in stylization, it's well conceptualized and then executed. There are presentation issues that I think could bother anybody, but they're going to come down to personal preference. In terms of all 50 chapters I've consumed, there was a dip in quality for little spikes of time, but never enough for me to start to feel like the series was a chore. And the overall, I just want to say, drip of the series as well really started to resonate. Something about this art style and the outfits, these guys have swagger. And I'm saying that about middle school kids, but the way they fight and treat, like some of them are just cool. I haven't thought of a middle schooler as cool since I was in middle school. But that has just been my review of Mob Psycho 100, or is that something different? I don't know. I just read Mob Psycho online. And a big thank you to Scentbird for sponsoring today's video. Have a good one, y'all. Peace. Don't worry, this backdrop will be changing and evolving rapidly, hopefully.